I was 8 years old the first time I realized my father was a man people listened to. He stood in the middle of our long driveway on a Sunday morning, coffee in one hand, the local paper in the other, talking to the neighbors about markets and construction, permits like a general directing a battle. To me, he wasn't Henry Carter, the founder of Carter and Harlow Capital, a company everyone in Arlington seemed to respect. He was just Dad. The man who took off his shoes before walking on Mom's new rug because she'd worked too hard cleaning it. Mom, Margaret, was softer. A high school literature teacher who could make Robert Frost sound like scripture. Every night she'd read to me and my little brother Ryan before bed. She always said stories kept the soul clean. Dad would smile at her, half amused, half proud, and say the world needed her softness as much as it needed his rules. Our house sat on a hill behind rows of maple trees that flamed red every October. It wasn't the biggest mansion in Virginia, but it was ours. And every inch carried their touch. The smell of Mom's bread on Sunday mornings. The sound of Dad's shoes crossing the marble floor. Ryan's laughter echoing from the hallway when we chased each other pretending to be pirates. That house was our world. The safe place Dad promised he'd always protect. He had rules for everything. Say thank you before you eat. Respect the people who work for you. Never lie when no one's looking. He'd look me in the eye and say, a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he does when nobody is watching. I didn't understand it then. I just knew I wanted him to be proud. Ryan was 9 years younger than me. The quiet kind of kid who'd rather draw than play football. I used to tease him for spending hours sketching the woods behind the house. But secretly I admired how he could make a pencil do what my hands couldn't. Mom loved that about him. She'd sit with him for hours while he drew, humming under her breath like it was her way of keeping the peace between all of us. Dad was strict, but fair. He believed in structure, in discipline, in never letting the world think it could break you. On weekends he'd sit at the dining table with his reading glasses sliding down his nose, motioning for us to sit beside him. What did you learn this week, boys? He'd ask. Ryan would talk about clouds and colors. I'd talk about football or science. And Dad would listen, as if every word we said mattered. When he spoke, it was usually short. A sentence or two that somehow stuck forever. Always do the right thing, even when it hurts. Always take responsibility for your mistakes. Looking back, I think he was training us long before we knew it. He came from nothing and built his company from scratch. So he believed struggle built character. He didn't spoil us. Even though he could have. When my friends bragged about their new cars at 16, I got a second-hand truck with a dented door. Dad said, if you can live with imperfection, you'll survive the world. Mom balanced him out. She'd slip $20 into my wallet and whisper, don't tell your father. She believed kindness was a different kind of strength. When she was around, the house felt like sunlight. When she wasn't, it felt colder, sharper, as if the air carried his discipline. One winter evening, snow blanketed the driveway. Ryan was 10, building a snow fort, his cheeks red from the cold. I stood by the window watching him when Dad walked in, still in his overcoat, face tight from another long day. He asked where Mom was. She had gone out to pick up groceries. She should have been back by now. The phone rang 15 minutes later. I'll never forget the sound of my father's voice breaking for the first time. There'd been an accident on Route 50. A truck had lost control on the ice. Mom's car was crushed. I remember sitting on the staircase that night, hearing him cry behind the closed door of his office. I didn't go in. Ryan fell asleep, clutching one of her scarves. The house that once felt alive became unbearably still. At the funeral, people spoke about her kindness, her laughter, the way she treated students like her own children. I barely heard them. I just stared at the coffin and thought this couldn't be real. Dad stood like stone, one hand on my shoulder, the other on Ryan's. He didn't shed a tear in front of anyone. After that, everything changed. Meals became quieter. The garden she'd loved grew wild. Dad buried himself in work, coming home late. Sometimes not at all. I tried to hold things together, to be strong like him. But the truth was, we were both just surviving. Ryan stopped drawing for a while. He'd sit in her old reading chair and stare at the empty fireplace. One night he asked me if I thought Mom could still see us. I told him she could, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Years later, when I left for the Navy, Dad shook my hand instead of hugging me. He said I was choosing a hard road, but he respected it. I remember thinking I'd make him proud, that I'd come back and the house would feel like home again. But I was wrong. By the time I returned, that house would no longer belong to the family I remembered. Something darker was already waiting behind those tall maple trees. Dad called me one evening, his voice steadier than it had been in years. He said he had something important to tell me and asked me to come home for dinner. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same from the outside, but it didn't feel the same. The garden was trimmed again. The porch light was on, and there were fresh flowers by the door. For a second, I thought maybe Dad had started living again. But I was wrong. Inside, a woman was standing in the hallway. She turned toward me with a polished smile, the kind you see on real estate billboards. Her hair was perfect, blonde and shiny under the chandelier light. She extended her hand like she owned the place. "You must be Michael. I'm Vivian." Her grip was firm, colder than it should have been. Before I could say anything, Dad came down the stairs, his suit crisp, face younger somehow. He said they'd just gotten married the week before. Married. The word hit me like a punch. My mother had been gone barely 3 years. Ryan and I hadn't even talked about dating, let alone replacing her. But there he was, proud and almost happy, introducing this woman like she was the missing piece of our broken puzzle. Dinner was quiet. Ryan barely touched his food. Vivian filled the silence with stories about her work as a financial consultant, how she'd met Dad through Carter and Harlow, and how she admired his brilliance. Dad smiled more that night than I'd seen in a decade. I kept nodding, pretending to listen, but my chest was tight. After dinner, when Dad went to his office, Vivian turned to me. She lowered her voice, still smiling. "Your father deserves peace, Michael. You should be happy for him." I didn't answer. I just stared at the painting behind her. One of Mom's favorites. Except it wasn't there anymore. In its place was a modern abstract canvas full of cold blues and grays. Later that night, Ryan knocked on my old bedroom door. He was 16 now. Taller, his face thinner. He asked if I thought Dad really loved her. I didn't know what to say. He just nodded and said, "She scares me." The next morning I found Mom's rose garden replaced with tropical flowers. The gardener told me Mrs. Carter wanted a new look. Hearing that name from someone else's mouth made me feel sick. Before I left for the base, I pulled Dad aside. "Are you sure about her?" He looked at me with that firm expression that used to make me feel like a kid again. "She makes me feel alive. Son, don't ruin that for me." So I left. The following months, the calls from home grew shorter. Dad was busy. Ryan said Vivian was rearranging the house, redecorating everything. One night he told me she'd turned Mom's old study into her own dressing room. I told him to stay calm, that Dad would come to his senses eventually. But I didn't believe it. By Christmas, I finally took leave and went home. The mansion looked different, brighter but colder, like a museum. Vivian greeted me at the door, wearing a red dress that shimmered under the lights. She hugged me as if we'd known each other for years. Dad looked tired, older again, but he smiled and told me how proud he was of Ryan's grades. For a moment, things felt normal. That didn't last long. A few days later, Ryan came to my room late at night, holding a torn sketchbook page. His hands were shaking. "She did it," he said, his voice cracking. Vivian ripped my drawing of Mom, said it looked depressing. Chloe laughed. Chloe was Vivian's daughter, around Ryan's age, pretty and sharp-tongued, always on her phone. She had that smug look rich kids get when they think the world belongs to them. Ryan said she called him a loser for spending his time drawing instead of going out. I marched downstairs, heart pounding. Vivian and Chloe were sitting by the fireplace, sipping hot chocolate like nothing had happened. "You tore my brother's drawing." Vivian tilted her head, calm as ever. "It was just a piece of paper, Michael. He'll make another one. That drawing was of our mother," I said, my voice rising. She smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time you both moved on." Dad walked in then, half asleep, confused. I expected him to defend us, but he only rubbed his eyes and said we should all calm down. Vivian touched his arm and whispered something I couldn't hear. I looked at him, waiting, but he didn't say another word. I left the next morning without saying goodbye. Over the next few weeks, Ryan called me almost every night. He said Vivian was making rules for everything. Don't hang old family pictures. Don't mention Mom. Don't sit in her chair by the window. It was like she was erasing her memory piece by piece. One night, Ryan whispered, I can't stay here anymore. I didn't hesitate. I started searching for schools far from Virginia. I found one in Massachusetts, a boarding school that focused on art and academics. I used most of my savings to cover the tuition. When I told Dad my plan, he looked torn. That's a lot of money. Michael, it's worth it, I said. He needs space. Vivian frowned. He needs discipline, not distance. Dad didn't answer. He just looked tired. The day I drove Ryan to the airport, he stood in the driveway with his backpack, looking at the house. The windows gleamed in the sunlight, but to him they might as well have been bars. I don't want to leave home, he said softly. This isn't home anymore. I told him, home is where we're together. He nodded, wiping his eyes. Dad came out to the porch, his hand resting on the railing. Michael, he started, his voice heavy. This is the right thing, I said. Vivian stood beside him, her smile polite, but her eyes sharp. She slipped her arm through his and said, he'll be fine. I turned away, climbed into the car, and drove off. Ryan waved through the window until the mansion disappeared behind the trees. That was the last time the house felt like mine. On the way back to the base, I tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing. I had protected him, just like Dad always said a man should. But deep down, I knew something in our family had cracked for good, and no amount of distance was going to fix it. Months passed, and I buried myself in work, taking on longer deployments, anything to stay busy. I told myself it was for discipline, but deep down, I knew I didn't want to face what home had become. Then one night, an email came from Mark Ellison, my father's old business partner and the former CFO of Carter and Harlow Capital. The subject line read, urgent. It's about your father. Mark never used words like urgent unless something was wrong. His message was short. He said there were strange transfers coming from the company accounts, large amounts moving into private funds tied to someone named V. Hayes. He attached a few spreadsheets with dates and amounts. My stomach sank. Vivian Hayes Carter. I called him immediately. He answered in a low, tired voice. Michael, I think she's moving money out. I can't prove it yet, but she's got power of attorney. She convinced your father to give her access. Something's off. I thanked him and promised to look into it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dad, the way he used to look over every detail, every contract, how he'd once told me trust was good, but verification was better. Now the man who built everything was letting someone else hold the reins. The next morning, I called home. Vivian answered. She sounded polite. Too polite. Your father's resting. Michael. He's been under the weather. I asked to speak to him, but she said he was sleeping and hung up before I could push further. That was all I needed to book a flight. When I reached Arlington, it was raining hard. The kind of steady rain that soaks through your jacket no matter how fast you move. The mansion looked darker than I remembered. The garden full of plants I didn't recognize, all tropical and out of place against the gray sky. 2 security guards I'd never seen before stood at the gate. One of them asked for my name before opening it. Inside, the air smelled like expensive perfume and disinfectant. Vivian met me in the hallway, her smile rehearsed, her voice dripping with sympathy. Michael, what a surprise. Your father isn't feeling well. It's not a good time. I stepped closer. I'm not here for tea. Where is he? Her eyes narrowed slightly, then softened again. Upstairs. But please don't upset him. When I entered his room, I barely recognized him. The man who once commanded boardrooms now looked small under the blankets. Pale and fragile. Tubes ran from his arms, and a monitor beeped steadily beside the bed. He opened his eyes slowly and tried to smile. "Michael," he whispered, his voice weak. "I didn't expect you." I pulled a chair close to the bed. "What's going on?" "Dad, Mark sent me something. Money transfers. He said Vivian has access." He looked away, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Finally, he took my hand. "I made mistakes. Too many." She said she could help. Help with what? He closed his eyes for a long moment. Protect the company. Protect her. Her. Before he could answer, the door opened. Vivian walked in, carrying a tray with soup. Her expression changed when she saw me sitting beside him. "Henry, you should rest," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Then she turned to me. "I think it's time for you to leave." Dad looked torn, like a man split in two. "Michael, please." "Not now." I stood slowly. "I'll go." But we're not done talking. In the hallway, Vivian followed me. "You need to respect his wishes," she said. "He's under a lot of stress. And you're not helping." I stopped, turned to face her. "What are you really doing here?" Vivian, her smile returned. Colder this time. "Taking care of your father. Same as you would if you actually lived here." I didn't answer. I just walked past her and out into the rain. Back at the hotel, I opened my laptop and went through Mark's documents again. Transfers to offshore accounts. New contracts signed without Dad's signature. And a name that kept appearing: Whitestone Holdings. A quick search showed it was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, created just 6 months earlier. I called Mark again. He said he was being pushed out of the company. Vivian claimed his methods were outdated. She brought in a new lawyer, someone named Charles Whitaker, and made him handle all of Dad's paperwork. It was clear she was consolidating control. I needed proof, something I could show Dad before it was too late. Mark suggested talking to Harold Green, my father's longtime lawyer. I remembered him from when I was a kid. A quiet man with sharp eyes and a sense of fairness that matched Dad's. The next morning, I drove to Green's office in downtown Washington. The place looked the same, full of dark wood and the smell of old paper. Green came out of his office when he saw me. "Michael Carter. It's been a long time." He offered me coffee, then listened quietly as I explained everything. When I finished, he leaned back, fingers pressed together. "I've been worried about your father," he said. "Vivian's been keeping me at a distance. She moved all his legal work to Whitaker's firm. That's not standard practice, especially for a man like Henry." "Do you think she's manipulating him?" He hesitated. "I think she's isolating him. But your father still has moments of clarity. And before his health declined, he recorded something, a message, of sorts. He told me to hold on to it until the time was right. What kind of message he didn't say, just that I'd know when to share it." I leaned forward. "Harold, I think that time might be now." He studied me for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. When the moment comes, you'll understand." That answer stayed with me as I left his office. I drove back through the city, rain turning into sleet, thoughts spinning. Vivian was moving faster than I expected, and Dad was too weak to stop her. I couldn't act without proof. But I also couldn't sit still. That night, Mark called again. "They're trying to fire me," he said. "Vivian says I'm interfering. Stay quiet." I told him, "Send everything you can find to a private email. We'll need it soon." When I hung up, I stared out the window at the city lights. Somewhere across town, my father was lying in a bed he once owned, surrounded by people he didn't choose. I wanted to rush back, to pull him out of that house. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. For now, all I could do was wait and plan. Outside, the snow started falling, soft at first, then heavier, covering the streets in silence. I watched it through the window until my reflection faded into the dark glass. And for the first time, I wondered if the man who taught me to always do what's right had already become a prisoner in his own home. A few weeks later, I got a call from Ryan. His voice was tight, the kind of tone that made my stomach drop before he even finished the sentence. "Dad's in the hospital. It's bad, Mike. They say liver cancer, late stage." I froze. For a second, all I heard was static. Then I grabbed my bag and left the base without a word. The flight from Jacksonville to Washington felt endless. By the time I landed, my phone was full of missed calls from Ryan, but none from Vivian. When I pulled up to the hospital, the first thing I saw was her car in the front lot. Spotless, even under the fluorescent lights. Inside, she was standing by the nurse's station, phone in hand, looking as if she was managing a business meeting instead of watching her husband die. Vivian looked up when she saw me. Michael. What a surprise. You could have called first. Where is he? She sighed like I was a child interrupting her. Room 412. But he's sleeping. And the doctor said no stress. I didn't wait for her. I pushed through the door. And there he was. Thinner. Paler. But awake. When he saw me, his eyes softened. You came. Of course I came. Ryan was sitting in the corner, his sketchbook in his lap. He looked older somehow. Worn down. Vivian hovered near the door, pretending to check her phone. Dad's voice was quiet. I've made mistakes, son. But I tried to fix them. You don't have to explain now. I said, trying to sound steady. You need rest. He shook his head weakly. No. You need to listen. There's a file. In my office. Green nose. Vivian stepped forward. Henry. You need rest. She pressed a hand to his shoulder. Her smile glued in place. He flinched slightly. I'll talk to him. Viv. Give us a minute. Her eyes flickered. But she nodded and stepped outside. When she left, Dad looked at me again. You were right about her. I should have seen it sooner. We'll deal with it. I said. Just focus on getting better. He smiled faintly. If I don't make it, you take care of your brother. Keep what's ours safe. My throat tightened. Don't talk like that. He gripped my hand. The same way he used to when I was a boy crossing a busy street. I'm proud of you. Michael. Remember, do the right thing. Even when it hurts. That was the last time I saw him conscious. 2 weeks later, he was gone. The funeral was held at St. John's Church. The same one where we'd said goodbye to Mom. The sky was gray. The kind of heavy gray that sits on your chest. Ryan stood beside me, silent. His eyes red. The place was full, packed with people from the company, politicians, old friends, and strangers in black suits. Vivian stood front and center, perfectly composed, wearing a black dress that looked more like a statement than mourning. Chloe stood beside her, pretending to cry, glancing at me between fake sobs. When the priest finished, Vivian stepped up to the podium. Her heels clicked on the marble floor like gunshots. Henry trusted me. She began, her voice smooth and confident. He wanted me to protect his legacy, his company, his estate. He knew I would handle it with grace and wisdom. I stood at the back of the church, my fists clenched. Ryan whispered. She's lying. Vivian kept going, her tone almost triumphant. Henry left behind a will, signed and witnessed. He made it clear that his estate, including Carter and Harlow Capital, would be managed under my supervision for the good of the family. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. I intend to honor his wishes. She smiled then, a small, smug curve of her lips, and I saw it. The tiniest flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't grief. It was victory. People began whispering. Some nodded. Others looked at me. I felt my pulse in my throat. Behind her, Harold Green stood near the altar, his briefcase clutched tightly. When Vivian finished, he stepped forward. His expression was calm, almost too calm. Thank you, Mrs. Carter, he said. But before we conclude, your husband left one final instruction. The crowd quieted. Vivian turned sharply. What instruction? Green opened his briefcase and pulled out a flash drive. Henry recorded a message shortly before his passing. He asked me to play it publicly, in front of everyone he loved. The room went still. Vivian's face drained of color. That won't be necessary, she said quickly. My husband's affairs are private. Green met her eyes. He was clear about his wishes. He nodded to the technician by the projector. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. For a moment, there was static. Then Dad appeared. sitting in his study, wearing a simple gray sweater. He looked tired but alert. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone," he said. "And if you're still in this room, you've been part of my life, one way or another." Vivian shifted, her fingers digging into her purse. He continued, "I built Carter and Harlow from nothing. Everything I owned came from hard work and trust. But trust can be broken." He paused, his eyes steady, voice growing stronger. "To my sons, Michael and Ryan, I leave the entirety of my estate and company. I know you'll protect it with the integrity your mother lived by. To Vivian, I leave enough to live comfortably, as a gesture of gratitude, but no more." The room erupted in whispers. Vivian's face twisted, but she couldn't move. Dad looked straight into the camera. "And remember, boys, never let anger destroy what love built." The screen went black. No one spoke. For a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the creak of the old pews. Then someone in the back whispered, "God." He knew. Vivian turned on green, her voice trembling. "That video is fake. This is manipulation." Green's tone stayed even. "The video was recorded in my presence and notarized." Ryan looked at me, tears streaming down his face. "He did it for us." Vivian stumbled, grabbing the edge of the podium. Her perfect composure cracked, the mask slipping just enough for everyone to see what she really was. I walked forward slowly, stopping just a few feet from her. "He trusted you," I said quietly. "And you betrayed that trust." She didn't answer, her lips pressed together, trembling. The priest stepped forward, trying to calm the room. But it was too late. The truth had already burned through the air like lightning. When I looked around, people weren't whispering anymore. They were staring at her. The way people stare at something that used to shine and now looks rotten underneath. Green packed up his briefcase. The technician shut off the projector. Ryan leaned against me, still shaking, still crying. But this time it wasn't just sadness. It was relief. I looked at Vivian one last time. She wasn't crying anymore. She just stood there, frozen, watching everything she thought she owned slip through her hands. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds had started to break, and the sunlight pushed through the stained glass, scattering red and gold across the floor. It felt like Mom and Dad were both there, somewhere in that light, watching us take back what was ours. But even then, I knew this wasn't the end. The video had exposed the truth. But Vivian wasn't the kind of woman who walked away quietly. She would fight. And I'd be ready for it. 2 days after the funeral, I drove back to the mansion. The air around that place felt heavy, like the walls still held the echo of my father's voice from that video. Ryan sat in the passenger seat, Wyatt, staring out the window. He hadn't said much since that day. Neither had I. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, just full of things we didn't know how to say yet. When we reached the gates, they were locked. 2 guards stood there, the same ones who had tried to block me months before. One stepped forward and said, "Mrs. Carter isn't receiving visitors. Tell her I'm not visiting." I said, "I'm coming home." He hesitated, then pressed a button on his radio. Moments later, the gates opened. Vivian was waiting at the entrance, dressed in black again, pretending to mourn. Her expression tightened when she saw us. "Michael. Ryan," she said softly, as if we were old friends meeting for lunch. "I think you've made a mistake. We just came to get a few of Dad's things," I said, trying to keep my voice level. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That won't be possible. The estate belongs to me now." Ryan stepped forward. "You heard the video. Dad made it clear." Vivian's gaze hardened. "That video was edited. My lawyer is already challenging it. The will that counts is the one he signed with me present." She reached into her purse and handed me a folded document. It looked official, full of seals and signatures. It said everything. The company, the house, all assets, transferred to her and her daughter. I stared at the paper, then back at her. "You forged this." Her tone stayed calm. "You can believe what you want, but this is the legal document. You and your brother have no claim here." Ryan's hands were shaking. He whispered, "She's lying." I put my arm in front of him. "Don't. Not here. I folded the paper, handed it back, and said quietly, "This isn't over." She laughed. A low, confident laugh that made my skin crawl. "It's already over, Michael." As we turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of Chloe on the staircase behind her, watching us with a smirk. Back in the car, Ryan stared straight ahead, his voice breaking. "Dad wouldn't do that to us." "He didn't," I said. "We'll prove it." That night, I called Harold Green. He agreed to meet the next morning at his office downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, surrounded by files, his tie loosened, eyes red from lack of sleep. I told him about the new will. He read the copy I had scanned and sent him, then set it down carefully. "That's not your father's signature," he said. "It's similar, but not exact. And even if it were, the timing doesn't make sense. Your father was barely conscious the day this was dated. So what do we do now?" I asked. "We find the original trust." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. "Before your father got sick, he created a trust leaving everything to you and Ryan. He wanted to make sure no one could touch it. The problem is, Vivian fired everyone who had access to those files. I had backups, but they're missing. Someone went through my office. You think she did it? I know she did, but proving it is another story." He rubbed his temples. "We need evidence, Michael. Not suspicions. Something concrete." That same evening, Mark Ellison called. He said he'd found something in the company's servers, a hidden archive that Vivian didn't know existed. It contained recordings of board meetings, financial documents, and emails from Dad's final months. One file was labeled Carter Trust, Backup. Mark sent it to me through an encrypted link. I forwarded it to Green immediately. Within an hour, he called back, his voice filled with cautious excitement. "This is it. It's real. Notarized. And time-stamped before your father's condition worsened." He paused. "Vivian's document can't stand against this." The relief that hit me was like air after drowning. But Green wasn't celebrating yet. "She'll fight back," he said. "She'll claim the video and trust are both fabricated. We'll have to take it to court." The next few weeks felt like living inside a storm. Vivian's lawyer, Charles Whitaker, filed motions to block the trust from being reviewed. She hired a PR firm to paint me as a greedy son trying to steal his father's estate. Reporters called my phone non-stop. Ryan deleted his social media after someone sent him a photo of the mansion, captioned with "traitor." Through it all, Green stayed calm. He built the case piece by piece. Mark testified about the financial transfers and the shell company. Former staff members described how Vivian isolated Dad in his last months. The hearing was scheduled for early spring at the Fairfax County Courthouse. When the day came, the courtroom was packed. Vivian sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a gray suit, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked composed. But when our eyes met, she didn't smile this time. Whitaker spoke first, arguing that the trust was incomplete, that Henry had changed his mind in his final days. Green countered with the video evidence and the digital trust file. Then he called Mark to the stand. Mark testified for nearly an hour, laying out transactions, emails, and internal memos. He ended by saying, "Your father told me directly that the trust was meant to protect his sons." Whitaker tried to shake him, but Mark didn't flinch. Next, Green played a short clip recovered from the archive. It showed Dad talking to him in his office weeks before he passed. Henry said, "I want my sons to have what I built. No one else. If Vivian fights it, tell them to trust the truth." The courtroom went silent. Vivian's lawyer stood frozen. She leaned over to whisper something, but Whitaker shook his head. The judge called a recess. Outside in the hallway, Ryan hugged me for the first time in years. He whispered, "We're going to win." I wanted to believe him. When court resumed, Vivian took the stand. Her voice was steady, almost defiant. She claimed Dad was confused when he made the video, that I'd manipulated him into creating a trust before his death. She looked straight at the judge, tears glistening on cue. Green waited, then stood. "Mrs. Carter, did your husband ever discuss Whitestone Holdings with you?" Her eyes flickered. "No." He handed her a document. This shows multiple transfers from Carter and Harlow to that company. All signed under your authorization. Do you deny that's your signature? Her jaw tightened. I was following his instructions. The judge leaned forward. Did Mr. Carter sign any document granting you full control of those accounts? She hesitated. Then said yes. Green smiled faintly. Then why is that signature identical to the one on the forged will you presented? The room erupted in whispers. Vivian's face went pale. She looked toward her lawyer, who stared down at the table. The judge called for order, then announced that the documents would undergo forensic review. Vivian's composure finally cracked. Her voice rose, sharp and panicked. You can't take this from me. He wanted me to have it. The judge's gavel hit the desk. That's enough. Mrs. Carter. The hearing ended with the court seizing all assets of Carter and Harlow until verification was complete. Green put a hand on my shoulder as we walked out. It's not over yet. But she's losing ground. Ryan exhaled. A mix of relief and disbelief. So what now? Now. I said. We wait. Outside. The spring air felt cold. I looked at the courthouse steps, then back at the city beyond. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. But deep down, I knew Vivian wasn't finished. Women like her didn't lose quietly, and whatever she planned next, it would come fast. A week later, the storm broke. The forensic report came back, and it was exactly what we needed. The signatures on the will and the bank transfers were confirmed to be forgeries. The digital trust files, however, were verified as authentic, time-stamped months before my father's decline. Green called me early that morning, his voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes after a long fight. It's over. Michael, we have proof. I didn't respond right away. I was sitting in the kitchen of my apartment, a cup of cold coffee in front of me, the early light filtering through the blinds. After all the sleepless nights, the endless hearings, it didn't feel real. When I finally spoke, my voice came out rough. So, what happens now? The judge will issue a final ruling this week, he said. But brace yourself. Vivian's team might try one last move. He wasn't wrong. 2 days later, I received an email from her lawyer. A settlement offer. Vivian was willing to withdraw her claim in exchange for half of the estate. Half. I stared at the screen for a long time. Ryan was sitting on the couch, sketching absently in his notebook. When I told him, he laughed, sharp and bitter. She's out of her mind. We're not settling, I said. He nodded. Good. Dad didn't raise us to negotiate with liars. The morning of the final hearing, the courthouse was packed again. Vivian arrived late, wearing a navy suit and dark sunglasses. Her daughter Chloe followed, her expression pale but cold. Green and I sat together at the defense table. He looked at me once, gave a small nod, and said quietly, Keep your composure. The judge entered, papers in hand. After a long pause, he began reading the decision. Based on evidence presented, the court finds that the will submitted by Mrs. Vivian Carter was falsified and therefore invalid. The verified trust established by Mr. Pliant, Henry Carter, is recognized as his final legal testament. Full ownership of Carter and Harlow Capital and all associated assets shall be returned to Michael and Ryan Carter. The room buzzed with murmurs. Vivian didn't move. Her hands clenched the arms of her chair, knuckles white. Chloe reached for her, but she pulled away. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. It was over. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps. Cameras flashed. Microphones shoved in my face. I didn't stop. Ryan and I walked past them in silence. I could hear questions shouted from every direction, but they all blurred into noise. When we reached the car, Ryan exhaled. Did we really win? Yeah, I said quietly. We did. He smiled for the first time in what felt like years. But victory didn't feel the way I thought it would. There was no celebration, no relief, just exhaustion and a hollow ache where my father should have been. That night, I drove out to the mansion. The court order had already been delivered, and the place was ours again. But the driveway was empty. No guards, no lights, no Vivian. She had vanished. leaving behind only silence. Inside, the house felt different, cold, lifeless, the furniture covered in white sheets, the air stale. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls like they were old friends. In the study, Dad's desk was exactly as I remembered it, except for one thing. A small wooden box sat in the center, sealed with wax. I broke it open carefully. Inside was a note written in his handwriting. If you're reading this, then I did what I had to. Protect what matters. Don't let bitterness take root. Family is worth more than any empire. Beneath the note was his old pocket watch, the one he always carried to board meetings. I closed my hand around it and felt the weight of it, like a reminder and a goodbye at the same time. Ryan came in behind me. He looked around the room. Then, at the note in my hand. What does it say? I handed it to him. He read it silently, then nodded. Guess he knew this would happen. Yeah. He always knew more than he let on. We spent the next few days cleaning the mansion, sorting through boxes, and reclaiming the pieces of our lives that Vivian had tried to erase. Every photo of Mom and Dad, every old book, every memory she'd tried to bury, we brought back. On the third day, as I was checking the security footage system, I found something strange. A set of recordings from the weeks before Dad's death. Most had been deleted, but one remained hidden in a backup folder. I played it. The timestamp was 3 days before he passed. Dad sat in his office, looking frail but alert. Vivian stood behind him, whispering something I couldn't hear. He shook his head, said something softly, and she leaned closer, her face tense. Then, she placed a document in front of him and handed him a pen. He looked up at her and said, "I told you no." She smiled tightly and touched his arm. The video cut out a second later. Ryan was standing behind me when it ended. His voice was quiet, full of anger. She tried to force him. I nodded. We have all we need to close this chapter for good. I sent a copy of the video to Green. He confirmed it could support criminal charges if we wanted to pursue them. But I didn't. Dad's words echoed in my head. Don't let bitterness take root. Ryan agreed. We'd won back the truth. And that was enough. Vivian disappeared after that. Rumor had it she sold her jewelry and moved to Florida under a different name. Chloe stayed in the city for a while, but eventually faded from the news too. With the legal mess finally settled, Ryan and I stood in front of the mansion one morning, watching the sunrise reflect off the windows. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass again. And for the first time, the place didn't feel cursed. Ryan turned to me. What do we do now? I looked at the house. Then at him. We start over. He smiled faintly. You really think Dad would want us to keep this place? No. He'd want us to do something with it. Something good. We didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew we'd figure it out. The fight was over, but the healing was just beginning. As I locked the front door and stepped outside, I caught the faintest sound of birds in the trees. The morning light spilled across the lawn, soft and golden. And for the first time in years, I felt peace. But somewhere deep inside, I could still hear Dad's voice, steady and calm. Protect what matters. Always. The months that followed were quiet. Almost too quiet. The mansion stood like a sleeping giant, stripped of its poison but heavy with memories. Ryan moved into one of the guest rooms while I stayed in the main house, trying to put it back together piece by piece. Every morning, I'd make coffee in the kitchen, look out at the garden, and think about how Mom used to hum while watering her roses. It still felt strange without her laughter echoing through the halls. One afternoon, Ryan came into the kitchen holding a stack of papers. I think I found something, he said. They were Dad's handwritten notes about charity projects he'd been planning before he got sick. He wanted to turn part of the company's profit into scholarships for kids in underprivileged neighborhoods. He had lists, names, even outlines of programs. I flipped through the pages slowly. Reading his neat handwriting, it was like hearing his voice again. Ryan looked at me, waiting. You think we should finish it? He asked. Yeah, I said after a pause. We should. It's what he wanted. That night, I called Mark Ellison and asked him to come by. When he arrived, we sat in the study surrounded by old files and dusty furniture. I told him about Dad's plans and asked if it was possible to revive them under the company's current structure. Mark smiled and said it was not only possible but smart. Carter and Harlow needed a new face, a new legacy. We spent the next few weeks working late nights, going through every document, drafting new mission statements, and setting up the Monroe Scholarship Fund in Dad's name. Ryan took charge of the creative side, designing the logo and layout for the website. Watching him draw again felt like seeing a part of our family come back to life. As the fund took shape, I began to notice how people reacted differently to us now. Some looked at me like I'd accomplished something great. Others still whispered about the court case, about how I'd exposed Vivian. The press had nicknamed it the Carter estate scandal. It showed up in business magazines for months, painting Vivian as a schemer and me as the dutiful son who fought for justice. I didn't care much about the headlines. What mattered was that Dad's name was clean again. One day, while cleaning out the attic, Ryan called me over. "You have to see this," he said. Under a tarp, we found an old wooden chest filled with family albums, letters, and film reels. Mom's handwriting was on some of the envelopes. We spent hours looking through them. Sitting on the dusty floor, there were pictures of Dad holding me as a baby, Mom laughing with Ryan in the garden, holidays at the lake house, and even old video clips of us playing in the yard. For the first time in years, I laughed without guilt. Later that night, Ryan asked me quietly if I ever thought about forgiving Vivian. The question caught me off guard. "I don't hate her anymore," I said slowly. "Hate takes too much energy. But I'll never forgive what she did to him." He nodded. "Me neither." A few days later, Green called. He told me the trust fund transfer was officially complete, and the title of the mansion had been reinstated under our family name. He congratulated me, but his voice sounded distant. I think he knew I wasn't celebrating. When I hung up, I walked through the house again. Each room held its ghosts. The dining room where Dad used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings. The living room where Mom used to make us recite poetry. Even the hallway where Vivian once posed for her guests, pretending she belonged here. That night, I made a decision. I told Ryan I couldn't stay in the mansion anymore. He looked surprised. "You want to sell it?" he asked. "No," I said. "I want to give it a purpose." We spent the next month transforming it. We hired volunteers, painters, carpenters. The plan was to convert the mansion into a community center for kids, a place where they could learn art, leadership, and creativity, something Mom would have loved. By spring, the first group of kids arrived. Watching them run through the halls filled the space with life again. Ryan set up art classes in the old library, painting murals with the kids on the walls. I taught basic leadership workshops in Dad's old office, telling stories about integrity and responsibility. One day, while the kids were painting, a woman approached me in the courtyard. She looked familiar, though I couldn't place her at first. She introduced herself as Angela, one of the nurses who had cared for Dad during his final months. She said she wanted to see the mansion one last time. We sat on a bench, and she told me quietly that Vivian used to monitor every visitor at the hospital. There were times when Henry asked for me or Ryan, but Vivian would send everyone away, saying he needed rest. Angela's eyes filled with regret. "He deserved better," she said. I nodded, though the anger that flared up inside me felt dull now, like an old wound. After she left, I walked to the rose garden. The new flowers were blooming. Ryan had replanted Mom's roses, pink and white, just like she used to grow them. I stood there for a long time, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. That night, I dreamed of Dad again. He was sitting in his study, writing something on a piece of paper. He looked up, smiled, and said, "You did good, son." Then he faded away. I woke up before dawn, the house still and quiet. I walked through the hallways barefoot, the wooden floors creaking softly under my feet. For the first time, the place didn't feel haunted. It felt whole. When I reached the balcony, I saw Ryan down in the courtyard, sketching in the morning light. The mural on the wall behind him was almost finished. It showed a forest, bright and alive, with two figures standing under the sunlight. He looked up when he saw me and grinned. Morning. I smiled back. Morning. It hit me then how far we'd come. From that first night Vivian locked me out to this morning filled with peace. We had taken everything she tried to ruin and rebuilt it into something better. Something real. Ryan stood up and stretched. He looked at the mural. Then at me. Think Mom and Dad would like it? He asked. Yeah. I said softly. I think they already do. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of roses across the courtyard. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing on me. I felt lighter, ready for whatever came next. Summer came slowly that year. The kind that soaked everything in golden light and made time move a little softer. The mansion, now the Monroe Center, was finally alive. Laughter echoed through the hallways that used to carry only silence. The sound of children running down marble floors replaced the hollow echoes of lawyers and court hearings. It was exactly what Mom would have wanted. A place where joy and second chances lived together. Ryan was in his element. He ran art workshops 3 times a week, teaching kids to sketch and paint their dreams. I caught him one afternoon sitting cross-legged on the floor with a group of 8-year-olds, helping them mix colors. They were trying to paint a forest scene, just like the one Mom used to love. He looked up and grinned at me with streaks of green paint across his cheek. You look like a damn tree, I said. He laughed. Better than looking like a soldier. That line hit harder than he meant it to. For years, that's all I'd been. A soldier. Every fight, every decision, every loss was about survival. But here, in this house that used to hold everything I loved and hated, I finally felt like I was building something again. In the evenings, when the center closed, I'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset settle behind the pine trees. Sometimes Mark would stop by after work to drop off updates from the company. Carter and Harlow was doing better than ever. The board had approved our new scholarship initiative. And for the first time since Dad's passing, the firm was actually helping people instead of just making money. You turned the name around, Mark said one night, leaning against the railing. Your father would be proud. I wasn't sure if I believed that, but I nodded anyway. We fell into a routine. The house, the center, the company. They all started to run smoothly. I thought the storm had finally passed. Until one morning, when an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It said, "You didn't win." No signature. Just that. I showed it to Ryan later that day. He read it and shrugged. Probably someone messing with you. Maybe. I said. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. One night, the alarm system went off. But when I checked the cameras, the feed was blank. Another time, one of our storage rooms was broken into. Yet nothing was stolen. It felt like someone wanted to remind us they were still out there. Mark came by again when he heard about it. He offered to install new security systems. Top-grade ones. He didn't say her name. But we were both thinking it. Vivian. I hadn't heard from her since the trial. As far as anyone knew. She'd vanished. But a woman like that didn't disappear. She adapted. A week later, I got a call from Green. He sounded uneasy. Michael. I just received a subpoena. Vivian's filed an appeal. She's claiming mental distress during the trial and coercion during the signing of the trust. I closed my eyes. Took a slow breath. She's still fighting. Yes. But she has no real case. He said. It's a delay tactic. Maybe leverage. Don't let it get to you. It did get to me. Not because I feared losing, but because I knew she wasn't after money anymore. She wanted to hurt us. To stain what we'd rebuilt. When I told Ryan, he slammed his sketchbook shut. Let her rot. He said, we've done everything right. I wanted to believe that was enough. But that night, when I checked the news, I saw a headline that made my blood run cold. Former widow of Henry Carter accuses sons of fraud and emotional abuse. Vivian had gone public. The article painted her as a grieving woman manipulated by 2 ungrateful heirs. Photos of her looking fragile and broken filled the page. She claimed we isolated Henry, forced him to change his will, and then turned the mansion into a vanity project to clear our guilt. The story spread fast. Within days, News vans lined the road outside the mansion. Reporters shouted questions every time I stepped outside. Some donors pulled their support from the center. Sponsors froze funding until the case cleared. It felt like watching everything crumble all over again. One night, I found Ryan sitting alone in the garden, the glow from the porch lights catching the frustration on his face. He looked at me and said quietly, "I can't go through this again, Mike." I sat down beside him. "You won't have to." He looked up. "You think we can fight her again?" I smiled faintly. "We've fought worse." The next morning, I met Green in his office downtown. He was already on the phone with a journalist, correcting misinformation. When he hung up, he rubbed his temples. "She's not just desperate, Michael. She's funded. Someone's helping her. Who? We don't know yet. But her lawyer's fees alone are too high for what she should have left." That hit me harder than I expected. If Vivian had found a backer, this wasn't just about revenge. Someone wanted what we had. A few days later, Ryan got a message on social media. A fake account with one photo attached. It was the mansion, taken from the woods behind the property. He showed me the message, his face pale. Whoever it was, they were close. We brought in security, changed the locks again, and installed cameras along the fence line. I didn't tell Ryan, but I barely slept after that. Every creak in the hallway made my pulse quicken. Then, one evening, as I was closing the center, my phone buzzed. It was Mark. "You need to see this." He sent me a link to a news segment. Vivian was standing outside a courthouse in Florida, giving an interview. She looked calm, confident even, and beside her stood a man in a tailored suit, his arm protectively around her shoulders. The caption read, "Vivian Carter and business partner Daniel Whitaker announce legal action to reclaim Carter estate." Daniel Whitaker, Charles Whitaker's son. I turned off the phone and stared out the window. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. For the first time in months, I felt that old tension crawl back up my spine. She wasn't done. She was just getting started. Ryan came downstairs a few minutes later, asking if I was ready to lock up. I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, I already knew what came next. Another battle. Another test of everything Dad had taught us. As we stepped outside, the wind picked up, scattering rose petals across the path. The scent was sharp and sweet at the same time, like something beautiful that still carried a trace of pain. Ryan looked at me and said, "Guess peace doesn't last forever." No, I said quietly, "but neither does fear." We locked the gates and walked back toward the house, unaware that in the darkness beyond the trees, a car engine had just started. The next morning started gray and heavy, the kind of morning that makes you feel like something is about to happen. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was Green. He told me the court had fast-tracked Vivian's appeal hearing. She was coming back to Virginia. When I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long minute, staring at the floor. I had thought I was done with courtrooms, lawyers, and her voice. But apparently, she wasn't done with us. By noon, Ryan was pacing in the living room, his hands shoved deep in his hoodie pocket. "She's not winning this time," he said. "She never was," I replied, but I could feel the same tension in my chest that I'd felt the day she locked me out of my father's house. The hearing was scheduled for Friday. We spent the next few days gathering documents, video evidence, and the forensic reports again. Green was confident, calm as ever, but even he looked tired. "She's desperate, Michael," he said. "She's throwing stones in the dark. Let her." When the day came, the courtroom looked smaller than I remembered. Vivian arrived last, dressed in black again, flanked by her new lawyer, Daniel Whitaker. He was tall, polished, with the same smirk his father used to wear when things were going his way. Vivian looked thinner, her hair pulled tight. When our eyes met, she gave me that same smile, soft and poisonous. The judge entered. The chatter died, and the case began. Daniel argued first, claiming Vivian was mentally unfit during the original trial, that she had been manipulated by me and Green. It was a circus act, full of emotion and empty of evidence. Green stood next, He spoke calmly, methodically, laying out every fact like a surgeon cutting out infection. He reminded the court that Vivian's documents had been proven fraudulent, that her own financial transfers showed intent, not confusion. Then he called Mark Ellison as a witness again. Mark confirmed that Vivian had accessed company funds under an alias connected to Daniel Whitaker's firm. The courtroom murmured. The judge leaned forward. Green handed over the proof. Wire transfers and emails. It was enough. Vivian's face went pale. Daniel whispered something to her, but she shook her head, eyes glassy. The judge called for silence. Mrs. Carter, do you have anything to add before I make my decision? Vivian stood, her voice trembling. I loved Henry, she said. He didn't understand how much I gave up for him. Everything I did was for his legacy. Her words cracked halfway through. No one believed them. Not anymore. The judge took less than 10 minutes to issue his ruling. The appeal was dismissed with prejudice. Vivian Carter was barred from filing further claims on the estate. As the gavel fell, Ryan let out a slow breath beside me. Green closed his folder and whispered, "It's finally done." Outside the courthouse, reporters waited again. But this time, I didn't run. One of them shouted, "Michael, any comment on today's ruling?" I stopped. "Yeah. My father taught me that doing the right thing doesn't always make you popular, but it always makes you free." Ryan smiled at that. Green chuckled. For the first time in years, I actually believed my own words. We drove home in silence. The mansion stood waiting at the end of the long driveway. Sunlight hitting the gray stone just right. It didn't look haunted anymore. It looked alive. When we stepped inside, the kids were already there, laughing, chasing each other through the hallways for afternoon art class. Ryan went to join them. I watched from the doorway, feeling something shift inside me, something like peace. Later that evening, as the last of the kids left and the house grew quiet, I walked out to the garden. The roses were in full bloom again, their scent warm in the air. I knelt, touched one of the petals, and thought about Dad and Mom. I could almost hear their voices, soft but steady, telling me I'd done enough, that it was time to let go. Vivian faded from the news after that. Her assets were seized, and Whitaker's firm dropped her within a month. Some said she left the country. I never checked. I didn't need to. A year later, the Monroe Center was thriving. We had expanded to 2 more towns, partnered with schools, and helped dozens of kids find scholarships. Ryan's mural became the symbol of the program, a forest full of light and hope. One afternoon, he and I stood on the balcony overlooking the garden. He was holding Dad's old pocket watch. "You ever think about selling the company?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. "But then I remember why we fought for it." He nodded. "Yeah. For them. For them." I repeated quietly. The sun began to set, casting the whole yard in gold. I could see the kids in the distance, their laughter carried by the wind. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to fight anymore. I felt content. That night, as I locked up the center and turned off the last light, I looked around the house one final time. The portraits, the old piano, the smell of roses in the air. It wasn't a reminder of pain anymore. It was home. Dad used to say a man's worth isn't measured by the money he leaves behind, but by what he builds when no one's watching. I finally understood what he meant. We had lost everything once. Then we built something better. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not the house, not the company, but the people who carry your lessons forward. As I stepped outside, Ryan called from the porch, his voice light. "You coming, Mike?" "Yeah," I said, closing the door behind me. "I'm coming." If you've stayed with me through this story, tell me what you would have done. Would you have fought back? Or would you have walked away? Let me know. I think my father would have liked to hear your answer too.